We're honored, thanks to Dr. Cheng, we're honored to host Dr. Neuman, if I pronounce your last name correctly, yes, from the journal Cell. She's a molecular cell. She is the scientific editor. Her talk is important for two main reasons for you. One, her career path. She has a PhD, she did a postdoc, and now she's doing a science-related non-research job. 20% of PhDs in life sciences in the United States end up doing science-related non-research jobs. So that's why I personally would love to hear her story. Also, irrespective of what career path you want to have, what career goal you have, as she very nicely mentioned it in her the topic of the talk, it's your currency. No matter what career, your publications are your currency. No matter what career path you want to end up getting into, you need publications. That's how you can define yourself as a scientist. Whether on a science-related, research-related, or non-related career path you end up being at. What could be better than hearing the insights from an insider? So I can continue and finish this off, but please join me to welcome her and enjoy her talk. Thank you so much.
And thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Xiaodong for helping to arrange this and set this up really rather quickly. And thanks to all of you for coming in and showing up. It's a packed house, so it's exciting. Right, so you mentioned that I'm at Molecular Cell. I've been an editor for almost 6 years now. My title officially is Senior Scientific Editor Reviews, so I handle half-time review content and half-time research papers. And part of that is sort of historical. I started at a reviews journal, so I've taken that experience and brought it with me to Molecular Cell. Okay, so a quick outline of what I'll tell you about today. So I want to give you some information about what professional editors are and which journals have them, because a lot of people don't know that a lot of the really top journals have professional editors. The common conception is that you're a researcher, you become a big name, and somebody asks you to be an editor for a journal. And there are journals that have that, but it's a bit different in what they do. I'll talk to you and explain what is the editor's job, and in the scientific publishing, what are we actually doing at the journals and doing with your papers. Give you some tips on publishing in a top journal like Molecular Cell. And then at the end, I'll tell you a bit about being a scientific editor. And if this sounds like something you might like to do, what are we looking for in scientific editors and when we're hiring, and what can you do to prepare for the role? Okay, so as you heard, I have a PhD. A PhD is required for the job. All of our editors have them, and it should be in a relatively related field to the journal that you're applying for, that you're going to be working at. That means that it relatively means, okay, you might apply to a stem cell journal, but your degree, your experience is in cell biology, but they probably wouldn't hire someone that has, say, a chemistry degree. So within the biological sciences, relatively related to what the journal is working on. Usually we hire people straight from postdocs. So we look for that postdoc experience as a way to broaden out someone's expertise. We do occasionally hire straight from PhD, but it's rare. And most editors do not have any formal experience or training in editing. So there's often a lot of informal experience with peer reviewing, with editing their colleagues' manuscripts, their own manuscripts, but we're not looking for people with journalism degrees. And then the professional editors work full-time. It's my full-time job. I'm not doing any bench research at all on one or sometimes more than one scientific journal. So which journals have professional editors? All the Cell Press journals, the Nature journals, the Science journals, PLOS journals, Journal of Cell Biology, the Lancet. So a lot of the high-end publishers have most of the high-end publishers have professional editors. Oops, I went a little bit too fast. The journals that have academic editors, which are active researchers who do this as sort of a side job, include PNAS, eLife, OncoTarget, most society journals, and almost all journals that have an impact factor of less than 5 are going to have academic editors. And there's a few journals that are sort of this hybrid method where they have a very small number of professional editors, but then they use academic editors to handle peer review, for instance, and that includes Scientific Reports, which is actually a Nature journal. It's a really, really large journal. And at Cell Press, we have Structure and Cell Chemical Biology that are also this hybrid model. Okay, so what about the editorial board? If I'm handling peer review at the journal, what does the editorial board do and how do they contribute and how is that different from what we as professional scientific editors do? So that at a journal like Molecular Cell, the editorial board is not involved in the day-to-day running of the journal. They're not handling papers, they're not making decisions, they're not inviting reviewers. That's all our job. Their role is really to provide advice on strategic initiatives and issues that come up that are bigger and more publishing realm type issues. They give advice on should we be moving into a new field, should we launch a new article type, for instance. We do also reach out to them sometimes to get informal advice. We have a new paper that's been submitted. We want to try to decide if it's right for us. Should we send it out to review? We might send them the title and abstract and ask for their input. And many of our editorial board members are also frequent reviewers. They're friends to the journal, and we may go to them quite often for peer review. And finally, they also help weigh in on difficult cases. Say, we have split reviewers and we're really not sure what to do, and we could use advice from someone who's an expert in the field. They sometimes weigh in on those. So how does that contrast with the professional editor? Our job, as I mentioned, we're overseeing the peer review process. We are setting editorial standards, so we're going across field and trying to ensure that we're consistent between fields, right? So all the editors get a look at all the new papers that come in, and we talk amongst each other to make sure that we're setting the same standard for a paper that is on DNA methylation versus a paper that's on autophagy. And we're also here to facilitate communication between authors and reviewers. We're facilitating that process and the dialogue between them. Our role is also to help ensure that the process is fast for the author. So, we're keeping track and keeping on top of the papers that are coming through and making sure that nothing slips between the cracks and sits at peer review for months on end. And part of our role is also engaging the community. A big part of my job is going to conferences, going out to universities like this and giving talks like this, and not only sharing the behind the scenes with all of you, but gathering feedback from you. To hear about what people think is exciting, what issues are important to you, and using that to make the scientific publishing process better. And then we're also driving the strategy. We ask for advice from the Ed Board, but really it's up to us in terms of how to develop the journal to make sure that it continues to meet the needs of the community. Okay. So that's a little bit of background about what the editor does. And so with that in mind, I will get into the tips on preparing and submitting and revising your paper. And I'm going to describe the tips sort of in the context of the life cycle of the paper. So the first step is to pick the right journal, right, in terms of the life cycle through the publishing process. And the second step will be, once it comes to us, the first thing we're going to see is the title and abstract. So I'll give you some tips on how to write a good title and abstract. The next thing we'll see is a cover letter. So I'll give you some tips on how to write an effective cover letter. And then we'll read the full paper. So I'll give you some tips on making sure the results are clear. And then finally, it'll go out to review. You'll get the comments back, and you'll need to respond to the reviewer comments. And so I'll give you some tips on how to respond professionally. What does that really mean? To increase the chances that the reviewers will respond positively to your response letter. And the overriding theme for all of this, I would say, if you have one take-home message, is empathy. And in terms of picking the right journal, think about the reader, think about the editors, and how they're going to view your paper. In terms of writing a good title and abstract, think about, what would catch your attention if you were scanning through a table of contents and trying to decide which papers to read. When you're responding to the reviewer comments, think about how the reviewer would interpret what you're saying. Would they be offended? Would they be convinced by what you're saying? So keep in mind, looking at it from the opposite angle, not just as the author, but the person who's going to be on the receiving end. Okay, so step one, pick the right journal. How do you pick the right journal? Well, the first thing you should probably go do is read the aims and scope page. Each journal is going to set out, they're going to try to give you information. We're not trying to make it a black box. So there's an aims and scope page that will tell you exactly, what are the topics that we cover and what are we trying to do with this journal and what's our main sort of value that we see as our unique identity. The next thing that you should do is look at whether the journal publishes on the topic that is your paper. So look at the papers that you cite in your own research. Are they published in that journal? And do a literature search of the journal and see if, search for keywords that are in your paper and see, is this journal publishing on mitochondria or not? And then thinking about the right journal, think about, many papers have multiple points to them. And think about what the main point of your paper, what's the single main take-home message, and which audience is going to find that most interesting. You might work on neurodegenerative disease and you're working on a protein within it. Is the main point that this protein does something cool and the protein biochemists are going to find it interesting, or is the main point that you've found something really important for this disease? And that's going to help shape what is going to be the right home for your article. And if you're still not sure after all of that, when in doubt, write a pre-submission inquiry. So that is when you write to the journal editors and you give title, abstract, maybe, at most one-page cover letter type thing of this is sort of the punchline of my paper. Do you think it's suitable for your journal? It'll save you a lot of time if the editor writes back and says, I think that it's really outside of our scope. That's a whole lot of time that you would have spent formatting the paper, submitting the paper, waiting for a reply that you've just saved yourself. Okay, and so why is all of this important? More than, saving yourself some time, even if you send it to a journal and it does get picked up and sent out to review, you want to send it to a journal where the editors are going to know the field, they're going to know the good reviewers, they're going to know what the important questions are that are being asked, and help guide the process of peer review and revision. If you send it to a journal where the topic is more tangential to the scope, the editors are just going to have a tougher time giving your article a fair shake. Okay, so you have picked your journal, you have submitted it to Molecular Cell. What happens now to your paper? The first thing that happens is that we get a list of all the papers that have been submitted in the last day, and we get a list that includes the title and the abstract, and that's all. It does not have author names on it. And all of the editors at the journal give their preliminary impression. Typically, we get this list of titles and abstracts 30 minutes before our editorial meeting, and there's between 10 and 15 new papers, so we have roughly about 2 to 3 minutes to give our initial impression on that paper. Let's see. And so it looks something like this. This is a hypothetical title and hypothetical comments from editors. And so our spreadsheet, this is the format that we use for our voting spreadsheet. And so we give our initial impressions thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs across. We can indicate if you're interested in handling the paper or if you would like to not handle the paper for various reasons. You can indicate if this was previously a pre-submission inquiry to you. Usually the person who handles the pre-submission inquiry will also handle the paper if it gets sent out to review. And then you usually put, maybe 1 sentence or 2 sentences of your initial thoughts. So first impressions matter. The voting will influence what happens with the paper. It's not binding, but it does influence our decisions. So for instance, papers that we're all leaning up or we're all down on will get less attention than papers that are in the middle or that have split responses. You know, things that say, for instance, if we're all leaning up on something, the editor will do a quick due diligence read and say, okay, yeah, that pretty much is consistent with my opinion. Let me send it out to review and invite reviewers, and it goes. Same thing if we're all leaning down. But if, you know, the ones in the middle you spend more time on because you really need to debate over it. But what does also happen is that sometimes, you know, we're all leaning down on something and then the editor reads it and they decide that, wow, there's actually something really interesting here. I think I want to send it out to review. So our sort of protocol is that if your intention is to go against the group opinion, initial impression, that you bring it back to the group to discuss it and sort of you make your case for why you think you should send it out. And if everyone says, okay, yeah, all right, or at least a majority says, yeah, I agree with you, then you do send it out. So that impression matters. If if we're all pretty positive about it in the beginning from reading that title and abstract, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be sent to review. All right, and that's exactly what I just said. Okay, so with that in mind about how important the title and abstract is for that initial impression, some tips on writing a good title and abstract. For the title, keep it short. Just there's been some studies that short articles with shorter titles actually get cited more. So it's important not just for us on that initial impression, but in the long run for how impactful your work is going to be. And try to make it declarative if possible. And what I mean by that is instead of saying, this study is in assay, we look at a genome-wide study of methylation marks. Try to make a statement. Try to say something about what you found within that title, while balancing it with keeping it short. In terms of features of a good abstract, write it with the reader in mind. Write it with thinking that, maybe you only have 30 seconds to capture the reader's attention. If you haven't captured the reader's attention in 30 seconds, you're probably not going to get them to read it for another 30 seconds, which is probably at least how long they need to read the entire abstract. So with that in mind, you want even your opening sentence to start to grab their attention. Write it, especially for a high-impact journal. These journals have really broad readership. Try to avoid making it too specialized, avoid unnecessary background, avoid jargon, avoid abbreviations if you can, and cut out any extra detail. Just make it thinking about if someone else, at Molecular Cell, you may have a molecular biologist who's reading this abstract that does not work on your field at all. Could they understand it? Would they be excited by it? And tell them why they should care. Structure-wise, stick to the key elements. You want a sentence that explains the context of what you're working on and why it's interesting. One sentence that explains the absolute essential background information. A sentence that explains the gap, the knowledge gap. A sentence or even part of one sentence, the knowledge gap and how you filled the gap, and then a very brief summary of your main findings. So if you imagine each of those things is one sentence, then that's 5 sentences, 120 words, abstract done. Okay, so after we've all voted on the titles and abstracts, then the paper gets assigned to one editor who reads it in full. And with that in mind, the first thing that we're going to read when we open up your full paper is the cover letter. So how do you make a compelling cover letter? So all the advice that I just gave on abstracts applies. You want to tell your story, you want to give the background, but that said, you don't want to just repeat the abstract within the cover letter. If you open your cover letter with something that reads identically to the abstract, the editor is going to stop reading and move on, and they're not going to get to the bottom of it because they're going to assume I'm learning nothing new. Why do I need to read this? So one thing that you should do with your cover letter, which you just don't have time for in the abstract, is to note similar papers that have been published by the journal and how your work might relate to that. In our minds, if you're saying, oh, my paper's a bit like this, and that you published in a bit like that, it immediately makes our mind go, okay, I can see how this would be published in my journal too. At the same time, you want to explain how it is different and how it extends the field, right? You don't want it to be, if it essentially has the same point of a paper that we've already published, there's no reason for us to publish your paper. Yeah, and tell us what work it's building on. So something that makes me sit up and pay attention is when someone writes a cover letter that says, you know, our work is building on this paper in Science, and this paper in Nature, and this paper in Cell. You pay a little bit more attention. If you're saying, well, it builds on this paper in this very low-level journal, it makes you wonder how much is this going to be a similar advance to papers published in a journal that's much lower tier than mine, or how is this going to be a bigger advance than that if it's building on something smaller? It's also helpful to point out competition and controversies. If you're aware of a paper that is a competitor and it's in submission somewhere else, without getting into specific details, without getting into specific identifying details, it's helpful to just tell us that you know there's competition, and we can rush. We're really willing to work with you and try to rush the peer review process and make sure things get through quickly so that your paper has the best chance of being competitive with that other paper. And the same with controversies. You know, one thing that we're looking for in papers is, does this resolve a controversy in the field? Not every paper needs to resolve a controversy, but that is something that is valuable to readers. So that is one thing that can help your paper stand out, is if it relates somehow and resolves an important controversy in the field. It also helps us know who to avoid going to for review, because sometimes people don't want to have someone on the other side of the controversy reviewing the paper. Okay, so after getting through the cover letter, we're going to be reading the full article in the main text. So some quick advice on how to make your main text accessible to the reviewer, but really, and to the editor, but also eventually to your reader, right, when your paper gets published. Try to use paragraph headings that describe concrete findings rather than saying, like, this section is about this broad topic. Try to make the main point in the paragraph, in the paragraph and group section headings, and use similar language in the figure titles so that it's easy for a person reading the article to say, okay, this section is about this topic and this is a take-home message. Okay, I can see this figure relates to that section easily. Put information where readers expect it to be. Don't try to make it a novel. Don't try to reinvent the wheel when you're writing your paper. When it comes to a scientific article, it helps to have things where people expect it. So, have a question at the beginning of the paragraph, description of the work in the middle, and the conclusion, the take-home message at the end of the paragraph. And try to make the figures as self-explanatory as possible, meaning that the reader doesn't need to have there isn't crucial information that's in the text and then other crucial information in the figure legend that you have to read and refer to back and forth just to understand what's going on in the figure. Try to label things as much as possible to make it so that, the ideal would be someone could look at a figure in absence of the legend, in absence of the main text, and be able to figure out what's going on. You can't always reach that ideal, but try to get as close as possible. And then use the text to guide the reader to specific parts of the figures. So, it's very common to, the standard is you're writing in the results section and you refer to figure 1 to demonstrate the point that you're making in the results. Well, you can even go beyond pointing out figure 1, panel A, and maybe direct the reader to the specific part of panel A that they should be looking at that supports the point that you're making in that sentence. So, figure 1, panel A, compare lanes 1 to 5, right? And that is very specific, and then the reader knows exactly where they need to go, and it's so helpful. Okay. So what are we really looking for? What sort of advances? And most of the points I'm going to make here are general for any top-level journal, and the point I'll make at the end is sort of our specific value at Molecular Cell. So does it report a broadly interesting and important finding? Obviously what's considered an interesting enough and important enough finding at Nature is going to be a little bit different than what's interesting and important enough for Molecular Cell. And that's where things get a little bit fuzzy. But when you're writing your paper, think about, this is what we're looking for. Do you tell us why this is broadly interesting and important? some people forget to do that. They assume that we're going to understand why, that we're going to know why, and that's not always the case. Does it provide a significant conceptual advance beyond what was already known? This is part of why it's so important to set up the gap. Tell us what we didn't know, and then explain how this paper answers that question. Is it within the scope of the journal? You know, a paper can be a really interesting paper, but it's just not right for us. It's not within our scope, and we may reject it without review because of that reason. And how does it compare with the papers that we've published or the papers that we've rejected? You know, we're not just looking at the papers that did make it all the way through, but we have a database of all the papers that have ever been submitted and what has happened to those. And so when we're making our decision about whether or not to send it out to peer review, part of what we're doing is looking at whether we've had similar papers and what happened to them. Did we reject them, and why did we reject them? Did we review them? And the intention here is to have a consistent rating, right? And to treat papers fairly. And have our reviewers weighed in on related papers before. If there's something that's similar in topic and in scope, what did the reviewers say about a paper like that? You know, did they, for instance, if it's an all in vitro paper, if we sent a similar paper out to review, did the reviewers want to see in vivo work? Is that going to be something that our reviewers expect? And if it is, then, you know, if we see that over and over again in similar papers, then it's not worth the author's time to send something like that out to review, because we know ultimately it's going to be rejected. And then the consistency issue, right? We want to try to be consistent over time with how we make our decisions. You know, it wouldn't be fair to an author if we decided to send out something to review because we thought it was interesting, and then a very similar paper comes along with a different point, and we say, oh, you know, well, we don't really think this is interesting, and it's 2 months apart. We want to try to treat authors fairly. And then the final point is, does it provide interesting and new mechanistic insights? And this is a value that we have at Molecular Cell in particular. This is really what sets us apart, and it's sort of our main mantra is we're looking for mechanism at Molecular Cell. That's what we're most interested in. And so that's an important part of evaluating new papers that come in for us. Okay, so we've evaluated all of these things within your paper, and decide we're going to send it out to peer review. The next step, of course, is we pick and invite our peer reviewers. And this is a little bit of an aside because there's not a whole lot of tips in here. It's more just kind of pulling back the curtain to tell you about our process and how we pick reviewers. Okay. So we try to include reviewers that are going to, you know, we usually invite 3 reviewers, and we want to cover the main topics that the article covers. If it's a very technically specialized paper, we're going to want to make sure that we have someone who has expertise in that technique. And we want to make sure that, you know, what are the main part of reading the paper is figuring out what are the main points of the paper and making sure you have the reviewers who are going to give you good advice on those main points. You may not be able to have enough reviewers to cover every little point of the paper, especially if it's across different, you know, if it's multidisciplinary, but you want to make sure you cover the main points. We try, when we pick reviewers, to balance new reviewers, people who have never reviewed for us before, with those who have reviewed for us many times. Part of that is because we know that they're going to be helpful and give us helpful comments, and part of it also is if they've reviewed for us many times, they have a good understanding at this point of what we're looking for and what our standards are. But at the same time, you don't want to become too much of like the old boys club and only go back to the same reviewers. So we always also try to throw in new people and fresh blood and get outside opinions. Okay. We respect excluded reviewer lists. When you submit your paper, you have an option to indicate suggested reviewers and excluded reviewers for competition and other reasons. And so we respect those lists. The exception is if their lists are too broad or too long. We may, you can't exclude everyone from a country, for instance. We may come back to you and ask you to further narrow it down a bit. But we wouldn't just, you'd get a heads up if we needed you to do that. We wouldn't just go to the reviewers on the list. on the excluded. We try to avoid collaborators, researchers at the same institution for conflict of interest reasons. And then a lot of people have questions about the suggested reviewer list. Do we use them? Or do we use that, do we assume that they're all your friends and avoid them? So this is really at the editor's discretion, and every editor seems to have their own kind of personal philosophy about what they're going to do with it. My personal philosophy is that, it'll never be that all of your reviewers come from that list. I might use one. On some occasions, I've used two if I'm having trouble finding reviewers, or if the people that have been suggested are the exact people I was intending to invite anyway. They can be helpful to us, certainly. Especially if but we always do due diligence. I never just say, oh, okay, they suggested this person, I'll just go invite them. I'm going to go and research them and figure out what are they working on, why would they be suggested to review this paper, and if it doesn't make any sense to me, if I can't figure out why their expertise would be relevant to the paper, there's absolutely no way I would invite them. Okay, so we've invited the reviewers. And your paper has been sent out to review, it comes back, you get the reviewer's comments, and our job is then to weigh the criticisms from the reviewers and make a decision on it. Okay, so a little bit for advice for you, you may be reviewing papers, what are we looking for in comments, and what comments are valuable to us? We want to see fair, constructive, clear criticism that balances the big picture with the small, detailed criticisms. Not any a set of comments that are like, this is a terrible paper, and leaves it at that is not helpful to us. But on the other side, it's also very frustrating, if someone who gets bogged down in the details and it's, this typo and that typo and a long laundry list, but you don't get a general sense of, well, did they like the paper or not? That's also not especially helpful. We would love, we've tried to actually, at Molecular Cell, we've implemented some templates to help people write good reviews. And part of the template includes asking reviewers to limit the number of points to, at most, 5 key points. I think 5 is a lot, of 5 clear criticisms, but that would be the maximum. We've asked them to organize their requests from most important major things that absolutely need to be addressed for the paper to be accepted, and then minor points that are either really easy to address, or you could take it or leave it. It would help improve it, but it's not essential for the paper to be accepted. And to make specific recommendations about what experiments need to be done, what questions absolutely need to be answered, and to explain why they have asked for these things. Because occasionally what a reviewer will do is a reviewer will say, oh, they should really do this experiment, but they won't explain why. And what if the author can't do that experiment? If they don't understand why they're asking for that particular experiment, then they're going to have a hard time thinking of, well, maybe there's something else that they could do that would answer that question. But if they don't know what the real question is you're getting at, then that's really hard. Okay. So, I thought I deleted this. So we have an option at Molecular Cell to do collaborative or cross-review on a case-by-case basis. We don't do this for every paper, but occasionally we have split reviews, and they're different enough that we're having a hard time consolidating them and synthesizing them. So we ask the reviewers to look at the comments from the other reviewers and then send us our feedback. Do you think that their suggestions are reasonable or not? And we also, we try to make this really collaborative. We invite authors to come to us and discuss their revision plans before they actually do experiments, so that we can see if we can give them feedback on whether we think they're going to be able to address the reviewers' comments by doing what they plan to do. Right, and I mentioned already we have a review template that we've been trying out, and it's actually, we've gotten past the pilot stage at this point, and it seems like we've gotten a lot of really positive feedback, both from authors and from reviewers, that it's helping them to in writing more constructive reviews. Okay. So now that we have valuable reviewer comments and we've synthesized them, we need to communicate the decision on the manuscript. And so we send our decision out. It's when we're trying to decide what to do, it's not a simple for or against. It's not like, okay, 2 reviewers are positive and 1 is negative, so yes, we're going to invite a revision. It's more nuanced than that, and I'm sure that you know that because there's this sort of cliche of reviewer number 3 that sunk your paper. But there's things that are going on behind the scenes that the author's not going to know, like, is reviewer 3, maybe reviewer 3 is someone who has reviewed for us many times and is very familiar with the journal and is a trusted reviewer, and the other 2 have never reviewed for us. Are you going to weigh the comments from those 2 who are positive the same as the person who has reviewed for you that you trust? Or maybe they have expertise in sort of this crucial aspect of the paper, and the other 2 are a little bit more tangential. So the other thing I'd like you to know is that decisions aren't made in isolation. So we tend to bring, especially if the reviewers are split, we tend to bring the decision back to the team and discuss it with the team so that other people have, try to check our own bias, see that the other members on the team have an opportunity to weigh in as well and ask. It helps for consistency between papers, and it helps to really check the individual bias. And then after all of that, then we write our decision letter, and different editors have different styles. I personally try to, when I write my decision letters, I try to give the main points of what I would like to see in the revision, and even if it's rejected, I try to say, these are the main reasons why we've decided to reject, to try to help guide the process and really go beyond what I want to do more than simply provide the reviewers' comments. I want to give them our thoughts in the decision letter on what we would like to see. And it doesn't always, sometimes we decide to overwrite a reviewer, and the author really needs to know that, and we try to communicate that in the decision letter. Okay, so now you've got your decision letter, you've been invited to revise, or maybe not, maybe it's been rejected and you want to submit a rebuttal. If you're going to submit a rebuttal, we typically ask authors to submit a point-by-point response, just as you would for a revision. So with that in mind, it seems obvious to say respond professionally, but how do you do that, and what does that mean? First of all, just let the reviewer's comments sink in. Let it sit on it. Don't see the rejection letter and then immediately 30 minutes later, send a rebuttal back to the editor saying this is all wrong. Just give it some time. It's perfectly reasonable and understandable that some things that are in that letter may be upsetting, and if you give it a little bit of time to sit, you're just going to respond to it more professionally. Try to focus on the scientific issues. Occasionally you see reviewer comments that have ad hominem attacks, right? And I hate getting that back from reviewers because different editors have different philosophies. Sometimes editors will edit out that stuff that is really just, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about sort of comments. My personal philosophy is I want to leave it all intact. So that means letting things through that are sometimes not professional. And I know that it's going to rub the author the wrong way and that it's going to make them mad because it would make me mad too. So when you're the point I'm trying to make is take the high road. Focus on the scientific issues. It doesn't help anything to fire back with, oh, well, that reviewer doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay. If there's anything you don't understand in the reviewer's comments, ask the editor. The editor may not understand as well. So the editor has, because we are the liaison, we can go back to the reviewers and ask for further clarification. And it would be better to do it then as you're writing your response letter than, to get it back from second round of review and have the reviewer say, oh, they didn't address this question at all, and it's simply because of a misunderstanding. And I've said this several times now, we act as the liaison. We like to interact and have a dialogue with authors. If you, when you're trying to decide how to respond, there are many instances where you have to make a decision between, do I really have to do this experiment, or maybe I can respond in the text or change the discussion to respond to that reviewer. And if you're not sure what to do, talk to us, send us an email. Many of us, myself included, I love getting on the phone with authors. Even if it's a tricky situation, I feel like a 30-minute phone call can save me hours of email back and forth, and I would much rather do it. When you're writing your response letter, try to address all of the reviewers' comments point by point. Don't gloss over things, even if they seem small, like typos. Somebody's pointed out a typo. Even if it seems small, try to address them all. And if you think that a reviewer is wrong about something, they've made some assertion, this has been shown before, or whatever, try to just treat it as an honest mistake, right? Not like they're out to get you and sink your paper. And just treat it as a misunderstanding. Oh, I think they might have been referring to this paper, but actually they didn't show this there. And finally, coming back to the idea of empathy, just put yourself in the reviewer's shoes and read over your rebuttal letter after you've written it, or have someone else read over the rebuttal letter and ask, would I have convinced myself? If I were on the other side, would I find these arguments convincing? Okay, so just quick summary of the tips that I've given you. You pick the right journal, write a good title and abstract, write an effective cover letter, try to make the results clear for the reader, for the editor, for the reviewer, and respond professionally to reviewer comments. And with that, I'll just switch to the last topic. I just have a few slides on this. If all of this sounds like it might be something fun for you and interesting, here I'm just going to give a few tips on what do we look for in editors, how do I spend my day, how am I doing on time, good. And some of the good, the bad, the ugly, what are the downsides of being an editor, and how you can prepare if you would like to go into this for a job. So what are we looking for? I mentioned, it's required that you have a PhD. You need to have excellent command of English. That doesn't mean that you have to be a native English speaker. I think that most people who are working in science would do just fine with this. And no, we don't require previous publishing experience. So in terms of the transferable skills, these are the soft skills, right? Communication skills, right? A big part of our job is acting as a liaison between, we're communicating with reviewers, we're communicating with authors, we're acting in between. You need to be diplomatic and be able to smooth things over. And you also just need to be able to communicate clearly and concisely is a big part of the job. Multitasking is a huge part. I have a lot of different things that I do, a lot of different deadlines that I'm juggling. You need to be able to switch very quickly between tasks and set short and long deadlines for yourself and meet them. And self-motivated, as I mentioned, there are oftentimes I'm juggling a lot of long deadlines, and I need to be able to self-motivate to make sure I'm doing what I need to do now to make sure I meet those deadlines that are several months or even a year down the road. And then other qualities we're looking for, a passion and a breadth of interest. You need to be interested in more than just the narrow topic that you've been working on. You need to have really, really broad interests that span a good portion of the scope of the journal that you would be interested in working at. And relating to the multitasking, you need to be able to work with tight deadlines and be able to sort of speed up your workflow as needed to meet short deadlines. And you need to have confidence in making tough decisions. And, there's a sort of thoughtfulness and that goes along with the job of, what we do is important. It affects people's careers, and you need to take that very seriously. And then it's also important to have an ability to adapt to changing environments. The publishing realm is changing very rapidly. We're dealing with things like open access and like preprint servers, and it's just constantly changing. And so being willing to adapt to those changes and interested in that, I think, is a really positive quality. In terms of what do I do on a daily basis, every day is different. So my schedule tends to work on sort of a 2-week cycle because we publish issues every 2 weeks. So I have deadlines that come around every 2 weeks. But with that in mind, sort of big scale over the course of a year, because my job is 50-50 reviews, well, it's supposed to be 50-ish, 50 in reviews and research articles. I spend quite a bit of time commissioning review articles. So this is reviews and commentary. So a lot of that is, what we're figuring out, coming up with ideas of what we should be publishing reviews on, and figuring out who the thought leaders are that I should get to write those, writing to people, following up with them. And then once review and commentary articles come in, another 10% of my time is actually editing, line by line editing them. We don't edit the research articles for clarity, maybe a little bit here and there, but not the way that the heavy editing that I put in to research or to review and commentary articles. And then 35% of my time is handling manuscripts. That's reading the new papers that come in, making decisions about whether to send them out to peer review, finding reviewers, inviting them, and synthesizing comments and making decisions. I've written communication that's really broad. That comes down to emails with people, lots and lots and lots of emails, phone calls, meetings with, going to conferences, going to lab visits like this. I travel to about 4 meetings a year, four week-long conferences, and then I usually have a few other lab visits besides. And then other editorial duties, we do things more than just handling papers. We organize conferences. There's a Cell Press blog you can write for. We organize webinars, and there's a lot of things, a lot of strategic initiatives around both within the journal and around Cell Press that you can get involved in. And so that's my other 10%. Okay. So what's the great part about being an editor and what is not so awesome? So some of the upsides, learning to see the big picture, getting out of your own little area that you work on and learning about all kinds of other science and seeing, one of the things I love most about my job is when you go and you talk to someone who's working in one field and you make a connection with the things that are the advances and the thoughts that are coming up in an entirely different field. I love that because someone working in either one of those fields might not have seen that, and you can bring it together in a review. You can connect people, researchers who are working on things, and help progress science. And you're really living at the cutting edge. These are unpublished papers coming to you. You're scanning the recent literature all the time. You're not working at the cutting edge. You're not making those discoveries, but you're as close as you can get to making the discoveries without doing it yourself. And where you're working in an evolving environment. I mean, the landscape you can see this as an upside or a downside, really, depending on your personality. Like I said, publishing is really changing pretty rapidly. And it's a pretty flexible job. I'm mostly working with a computer, so it depends on your supervisor, but most of them are pretty flexible about when you start, when you finish, where you work from. It also depends on sort of the company that you work for. Some companies, it really is computer work, so you could, in theory, do it anywhere. Most of our editors come into the office in Cell Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but a lot of other journals have editors working all over the place. And then the travel, I mentioned I go to 4 conferences a year. It's really fun. Next year, in January, I go to Vancouver. In March, I go to Italy. In May, I go to Germany. And then in June, I'm in San Diego. So, and I haven't planned after June yet, so we'll see. So it's fun. It's a lot of, if you like travel. And so that's one of the really big pluses for the job. Some drawbacks, there's burnout. There's definite burnout in this job. The workload can be high, the stress can be high. You're constantly getting that new onslaught of papers, and everyone reaches this point where everyone wants to do a great job. We're all type A personalities. We're all detail oriented. We all want to do a great job, but ultimately you get to a point where you have to say, I have such a large workload. I have so many other things I have to do. I have to do the best that I can with the time that I can allow a lot for this. I can't take as much time as I want. And being able to do that, there are some corporate aspects. It is a desk job, right? You can't go into work wearing your t-shirt and your shorts. You need to dress nicely, and there are some corporate aspects that are not so fun. It's very structured in terms of we write a set of goals that we have to upload to a website at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year we have to come back and say, did you accomplish this one goal or not? And then that determines whether or not you get a raise. And it's very it's corporate, and And the other thing I think that gets to a lot of people is that you need a thick skin. You know, I mean, as you can imagine, people's careers are on the line and they get emotional, and that's completely understandable. And sometimes that turns into personal attacks to you, and you need to be able to not take it personally and to rise above and respond professionally. All right, so if you would like to become a scientific editor, what should you do to prepare for this job? Okay, so writing and editing research articles, review articles, commentary articles, you know, you can go beyond your own stuff that you're working on and ask your mentor for opportunities to do this. You know, somebody who's a big name in the field is going to get invited to write commentary and review articles frequently, and tell them that you're interested in helping write those things. Read more broadly, scan the table of contents for every new issue, for Nature, for Science, for Cell. That doesn't mean you have to read every paper that they published, but look at the titles and abstracts and see, you know, so you get a sense of what do people think is interesting and exciting outside of your own field. Help your advisor peer review articles. Again, you need to let them know they might, if they're not already asking you to help them peer review, tell them you would like to do this. And as a training opportunity, not that they give it to you and you do everything, but you know, that if they're willing to, you read the paper, they read the paper, you come back together and discuss it. Because, you know, so much of it helps you get an understanding of the process and what makes good peer review comments. Take leadership roles. You know, we look for people that have taken leadership roles outside of the lab, you know, whether that be a student group, right? Become involved in a student group, something that's going to demonstrate your passion. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a passion for scientific communication, just your passion in general, and showing that you're willing to kind of go above and beyond for whatever it is that you are interested in. And freelance editing, you know, or there are companies that you can sign up as a contract editor and take on editing as many articles as you want. So I did that as a side job, sort of, when I was a postdoc. And, you know, it's sort of one of those things I think it's helpful to people to do. It does, in terms of helping you see if this is something you would like to do long term. I also, when I see it on a CV of someone who's applied, it helps tell me, okay, they're really serious about this, that this is not just some backup career, that they couldn't get the career they really wanted, that they're interested in this in and of itself. And then talk to an editor. You may see us at conferences, you may see us on these lab visits. If you have questions, if you want to know more about the career, we're always willing to chat about it. And the last tip would be blog or microblog with Twitter about science. Try to communicate. Try to talk to, you know, try to communicate in writing about, it's great practice about why certain, you know, why new papers that come out or that you see are interesting, and use it as an opportunity to help expand your breadth. Okay. So that is the end. The one thing I wanted to point out is I wanted to direct everyone to Crosstalk, which is the Cell Press blog. So everything I've talked about here today in terms of going behind the scenes with publishing and alternative careers, we have more articles like these on Crosstalk. And you can see some of the stuff that people are really interested in. Those are the top list of top posts. One of them is writing the right cover letter. I stole some things from that post. And if you'd like to reach out to me, I'm happy to connect. I didn't write my LinkedIn URL, but I'm on LinkedIn. Please connect. Please send me an email, and Neuman@cell.com. I'm happy to provide any advice that I can. Thank you. All right. Questions?
Do the reviewers, have they also published in Cell overall or Cell molecular?
Sometimes, but not always. Yeah, it's not an excluding factor.
How do you choose your cover photos, and do you have room for scientific illustrators?
So our cover photos are almost exclusively submitted by authors. So authors or someone in their lab, or occasionally they have people at artists at the university that can help them make a cover. The exception would be like this Mechanisms of Sensing. That one, it was a special reviews issue, so It's a stock photo. Yeah, but we do at Cell Press, we have 3 full-time scientific illustrators. It's very specialized. They're trained illustrators who have gotten additional training in scientific illustration, but they mostly work on Cell.
If I'm looking to potentially write like reviewers I'd like to exclude, how do I know the minimum qualification of the reviewers you're considering? You know, are you really only looking for PIs with the R01 when possible, or is it possible that one of those assistant professors gets sneaked in there?
It is absolutely possible that, so the cutoff would be at the, assistant, at the PI level. We wouldn't, I wouldn't be looking to postdocs to invite them, but I don't check R01 status. You try to get someone with, it's a balance of you want them to have the right expertise, and you usually want one general reviewer who's who's working on a lot of different topics, who can provide the sort of general viewpoint, is this broadly interesting, and then you want somebody else who's more specialized and a little bit closer, focused on the topic. So it all, in terms of the level, it all depends.
We were talking about how the landscape of publishing is changing, and I was talking to you earlier about open access and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about how it's changing and your opinions on that?
Yeah. So open access is becoming a much larger part of the publishing world very rapidly, and it is changing how we're doing things. As a company, historically, we have made most of our money on subscriptions. The libraries have subscriptions to the journals. You can't sell a subscription to an open access journal. Open access journals, by nature, make us less money. And so they push toward this model of volume in order to be profitable. But longer term, it has all of the publishing companies thinking about how are we going to continue to add value for scientists beyond selling, when all of the subscriptions sort of go away eventually. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we make tools that will turn all of this literature into actionable knowledge, right? How do we make things that make scientists' lives easier and speed the progress of science that go beyond delivering this unit of scientific information? And so my company in particular is shifting toward a technology focus because of that. We're still going to publish forever, but our revenue is going to come from different places. Another big shifting thing is the rise of preprint servers. BioArchive in particular is within biology is growing very, very rapidly. And so we've had to sort of pivot a little bit in how we handle them and treat them. Over time, our current philosophy is that putting something on a preprint server will not exclude you from consideration. So you can put your paper on a preprint server and then submit it to us, and it will not. We do not consider that previous publication, so it will not affect our consideration of it. And the same goes for a competitor. If a competitor has put a paper on a preprint server, if the paper is not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal, it might as well not exist in terms of us considering the paper. So people are using it, for a variety of reasons. One is to gain feedback from people in the field. One is to speed the progress of science. And, for instance, if you create a tool, then somebody else doesn't have to wait for the paper to get published to start using that tool. And I think those are great reasons to use preprint servers. Other people are trying to use it to establish that they figured out something first. And I think that it's not as useful for that. So that's sort of, I think that overall, it's anything that's going to speed the progress of science, I think that we're perfectly happy with, and I don't think that it's going to ultimately change. So far, it's not hurting journals.
So what criteria do you use to evaluate a review, and what makes a good review on your personal?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a few things. In terms of if it's a new proposal for a review, one thing you're looking at is the person a recognized expert? Have they published in this topic that the review covers? Because people do read and cite reviews in large part based on who is writing them. And the other major factor is the topic. So is the topic timely? Have there been a lot of recent advances? Is the scope broad enough? How many researchers do I think are going to be interested in this scope? Does it need to be broader? Is it too broad? Finding that balance of getting into enough detail for your journal, but not too much detail that it's too specialized, right? And then also thinking about the landscape of, are there a bunch of other reviews that have been published recently on this topic? And then in terms of the review itself, I look for a few key things. One, I'm looking for clarity and structure. Does it have that balance of detail but big picture? And one thing I really always try to push for is that I want the authors to go beyond summarizing the papers and really synthesize it into, bringing it all together to give a bigger picture that you might not have understood from just reading the individual papers, and to provide, point out the controversies, take a stand on the controversies when they can, and point out what are the big unanswered questions, because that's what leads to new research. You identify the gaps, and then somebody says, "Oh, that's interesting. I want to go work on that and figure out an answer to that."
Yes. What makes a more competitive applicant for a scientific editor position?
Yeah. So the cover letter is honestly, a lot of the CVs, a lot of CVs look the same. There's very little differentiating in the CVs. It helps, I think, if you have published in a journal that is a similar level and tier to your, and subject matter to the journal you're applying to. You don't necessarily have to have published in that journal, but something similar, But the cover letter really sets different applications apart, and demonstrating in the cover letter that you can explain the bigger picture of the science that you're working on without getting bogged down in the details, that it demonstrates your passion and your interest, that I can read, if I read the cover letter and I know that the person is really interested in this job and it's not just the stock cover letter they send to all the postdoc all the postdoc positions they're applying to, then that really helps make it stand out. Okay.
How long is the process of submitting the paper until you get the review or get rejected? And if it's accepted, like when if you send for review, how long it takes to get the comments back?
Yeah, so we try to make a decision within about 4 days of it being submitted about whether to invite reviewers or reject. And then a few more days to invite the reviewers. We try to get an initial decision back, if it's going out to review, try to get an initial decision back within a month. Yeah.
To piggyback off one of the questions, how valuable is a postdoc experience for a student that already has significant editing experience?
Sorry, a student that already has significant what?
How valuable is a postdoc position for a student that already has significant editing experience? What would the position give them that just getting a PhD?
Yeah, the value in the postdoc is sort of demonstrating breadth. I think that if someone had a lot of writing that they could point to that showed us that they could write about a bunch of different scientific topics, I wouldn't care if they had a postdoc. But most people don't have that to really demonstrate that. So, seeing that someone has worked on something different than they did in their PhD helps demonstrate to us that, they have a breadth of interest. But yeah, you could achieve that through other ways.
They have to be published, these evidence of scientific writing.
If it were a blog, I think that would be, that'd be fine.
I have a curiosity actually. You said you go for lab visits?
Yeah.
What was that? What do you do that for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a lab visit right now. So what I do is on a lab visit, that means I go to an institution and I meet with the researchers, some of the researchers there, and talk to them about their science, get feedback on the journal, feedback on publishing, what are their thoughts on the publishing world. And then also a big part of it is usually giving talks like this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for your initial process, for those papers being voted or summed up, are those papers still being read by a specific editor or just?
Yeah, every paper is read in full, but a paper that is all voted down we probably won't look at it as carefully as we would have if we were sort of on the middle, but every paper will get read.
So in the middle, sum up, sum down, those papers are.
They're gonna get a more careful read, careful background search, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also you said that the initial process does not reveal the author's identity. That's
specific to our journal.
Oh.
So not every journal does that. In fact, yeah, I think we might be the only one at Cell Press actually that does that. That we do that to try to remove bias.
So when the author's identity revealed?
When we are reading the full paper.
This is the same for reviewers? That you first send a title and abstract, now they see the author's comments.
Yeah, the email that we send out to invite reviewers does include author names on it. Although what I've taken to doing, so if I'm looking for informal feedback on whether it's suitable, usually I'm writing to like an expert in the field or someone who I might consider as a reviewer. At that informal feedback stage, I do not include author information. And I find that very valuable. You know, there have been situations where I'm asking feedback on something that is a well-known name in the field, and I feel like I get much more candid feedback than I might have if they'd known who it was. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.